Hey, it's Jeff Green with Green Financial Group. Thanks for tuning the video blog today. Today is part one of our three-part series of my interview with Brian Wesbury, Chief Economist with First Trust Portfolios. Stick around, it's going to be good. All right, so welcome. We're here with my old friend Brian Wesbury again, Chief Economist of First Trust Portfolios, the antidote to conventional wisdom, as you like to say. Good to see you, Brian.
Good to see you.
And we do this once a year, so it's always fun to come hang out with you once a year. Let's get right into it. GDP came out this morning. We were talking about that right before we started this. Tell us about GDP and what those numbers look like.
So remember, GDP is it comes when it's reported as an annualized rate of growth. So we were expecting 2% real GDP growth, which really would mean it only grew 0.25% in the quarter, but we always annualize it. It came in at 3.3, which blows away our forecast. By the way, it blew away every forecast. No one expected GDP to be as strong as it was. And it's really kind of amazing. We finished 2023 at a 3.1% growth rate, which is the same growth rate we had in 2019 before COVID.
Right.
I don't believe the underlying economy is really that strong, and we can talk about that a little bit. But this was a really good number. Inflation was low. It came down to about 1.5% for the GDP number as a whole. And when you put all of that together, the market's up. Bond yields are down because inflation seems under control. It's the perfect number if you're Joe Biden.
Well, I want to get into that for just a second also, but I want to back up for just a minute because you won an award, and it was a 22.
Yep.
22 Consensus Economics, right? Or Consensus Economic Forecast Accuracy Awards for the U.S. in 2022. You and Bob Stein, your partner.
Right.
Phenomenal. So I wanted to preface that, make sure we got that out because I want everyone to know who we're talking to here, right? Yeah. A guy that knows his stuff, and you do know your stuff. The GDP, and this is what I've always thought, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. It's an election year, right? So I always get the sense that the Fed or some underlying something does something to prop up the economy because what does every incumbent want? They want to be reelected.
Right.
And so it always seems that we have a good economic year during a presidential election year.
Right.
Is there any truth to that, or what? How do you see that? Or is that what is this? Is there something underlying that is making this GDP number? Because I don't think the economy appears to be strong.
Right.
But there are some chinks in that armor right there. So, if you could talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Your thoughts
well,
there.
I would remind everybody that, and since, a lot of people that are watching this are probably in Texas, that George Bush, it was his last year, but it was not a good year.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, wait, it was a ugly year.
Right.
So it's not always true, but you're absolutely right that Washington and the bureaucrats will tend to try to do things to help in an election year. So, for example, one of the things that surprises me is that a bipartisan group of Congress voted to pass the child tax credit, and they're going to be sending out $300 checks in 2024.
More money.
And so what's interesting is Chuck Schumer, the Democrat leader of the Senate, had a big check, a U.S. Treasury check in front of him. He goes, $300 from President Biden and the congressional Democrats. And I haven't seen Republicans try to take credit for it, but it is interesting that as they go into an election year, in the congressional races or the Senate races, they can say, look what I got for you. And so they all do it to help themselves. And I would argue there's, for a belief that the economy is going to do well in an election year, it's not far-fetched. This year, I think, is going to be a little tougher, but there's some reasons for that. And that's because Washington is self-interested.
And these things that they do to prop up economies and make things look good during election years, those are short fixes. Those are temporary fixes, right?
Exactly.
Like they're a Band-Aid on a bigger problem.
Right.
And then they tend to create more problems later on?
They do. Like, so I'm a anti-Keynesian, which John Maynard Keynes, one of the most famous economists in history, he always believed that what would happen with economics is that you get business cycles, and he called them market failure. So we had too much speculation, businesses built too many inventories, they overinvested, people bought too many houses like they did in 07. And then we go into trouble, and then government has to fix things. And he would argue that government spending, you come in and it would help the economy. And I would argue that in the real short term, this can be true. For example, in last 2023, the data we just got today, we gave $200 billion to semiconductor manufacturers to build new plants. And that's instantaneous additions to economic activity, and it makes it look good, but we had to borrow that from somebody else, and it's going to have to be paid back in the future. It's like, the way I kind of say it is, if you run up all your credit cards, like going to Hawaii and buying drinks with umbrellas in them, you can have a really good time. But the hangover,
you don't have to pay for it.
It's costly.
You have to pay for that sooner or later. You talk a lot about normal versus new normal and where we are. We talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, normal is not COVID, all right? Locking down the economy, printing all of this money. And the question is, are we going to settle down? Are we going to actually go back to... So I think I've used this analogy with you before. I'll do it again. I feel like the COVID lockdowns were kind of the equivalent of a car accident. We had a car accident. We broke our leg in 4 places. And then the ambulance pumped us full of morphine. And then they take you to the emergency room and they go, "Hey, how you feeling?" and you go, "I feel great." But the doctor has to remind you you're not great. And so I keep feeling like what everybody thinks is that we were somehow able to lock down for COVID, have 6 million people out of work on average for 3 solid years, cause massive supply chain crises, and put all kinds of small businesses out of business, all of those things, and somehow we don't have to pay a price. And I don't believe that. So I would argue that what we're going to go back to is more of a new normal, where we pay a price for that before we actually get back to normal. And also the thing that we have to think about longer term, and this is where it's the difference. So Keynesian spending, I guess you could argue, helps things in the short term. But in the long term, having that bigger government, the higher taxes, the more interest on our debt, all of that becomes a burden. And so what we did during COVID is we increased the size of the Fed. We increased prices because they printed too much money and we had inflation, and we increased the size of government. And now we have to carry that into the future. So we're not going to go, we changed things amazingly during COVID. The size of government, the role of the Fed, how it operates. That's kind of what I'm getting to, that if everybody thinks we're kind of going back to the 1960s or 70s, nostalgia for the way things did work, government's way bigger now.